You're watching the 2018 Legatus Summit.
I am privileged to introduce our next speaker for the morning. Featured frequently on major networks such as ABC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, and Fox News, as well as in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, among others. Ryan Anderson is a renowned expert on marriage, bioethics, religious liberty, political philosophy. His latest book, When Harry Became Sally, is among his many works engaging the challenges and threats to modern religious and societal freedoms. He is also the founder and editor of The Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. His invaluable research has been cited by two U.S. Supreme Court justices, Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, in two separate cases. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude, and received a doctoral degree in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. Ladies and gentlemen, Ryan Anderson.
Thank you, and thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you all for having me speak to you this morning. It's a little unfortunate having to speak after Scott Hahn. Dr. Hahn's talk is so energetic, and it's encouraging, and it's inspirational. And this talk will be none of those things. And I'm serious. This is a book that I did not want to have to write. It comes out next month. It's titled When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. It's a talk that I don't enjoy giving, partly because there's some very sad realities that have gained new currency in our culture. And that's what I want to address you this morning about. 28 years ago, the release of the movie, When Harry Met Sally, dealt with one big question: whether men could really be just friends with women. Today, we're forced to answer a different question: whether men can really become women. America's in the midst of what's been called a transgender moment. Not long ago, most Americans had never heard of transgender identity, but within the space of a year, it's gone to a cause claiming the mantle of civil rights. But is it true that a boy can be trapped in a girl's body? Is our sex assigned to us? Can modern medicine reassign sex? What's the most loving and helpful response to a friend or a family member struggling with their gender identity? And what should our law say about these issues? Now, these shouldn't be difficult questions. In the late 1970s, Dr. Paul McHugh thought he had convinced the vast majority of his professional colleagues not to go along with the radical claims that were being made about gender and gender identity. McHugh had received a world-class education, first at Harvard College and then at Harvard Medical School. He now found himself as the psychiatrist-in-chief of Johns Hopkins Hospital and the chair of the psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins Medical School. And so he was now responsible for what was going on at Hopkins. And in 1979, he put a stop to sex reassignment surgery. After he did that, many other elite medical institutions across the country followed his lead. But in recent years, we've seen a resurgence in sex reassignment procedures, not in light of new scientific evidence, but under the pressure of ideology. And so the people who are in the spotlight of the transgender moment are children. 10 years ago, in 2007, Boston Children's Hospital became, quote, the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children and adolescents, end quote, as its website brags. Today, a decade later, there are more than 45 pediatric gender clinics. They tell parents that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent teen suicide. Never mind that the best studies on gender dysphoria, the studies that even the activists cite themselves, show that somewhere between 80 to 95% of children who struggle with their gender identity will naturally grow out of it and come to identify with their bodies if their development is not interfered with. Never mind that transitioning treatment has not been shown to reduce the extraordinary high rate of suicide. People who identify as transgender, 41% of them will attempt suicide at some point in their lives, compared to 4.6% of the general population. And never mind that people who have had the transition surgery, they're 19 times more likely to die by suicide. These statistics should stop us in our tracks. They're heartbreaking, and they certainly should make us cautious before we rush into promoting transition in our nation's schools. So in my forthcoming book, what I argue is that Dr. McHugh got it right. That the best biology, psychology, and philosophy all support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality and of gender as a social manifestation of bodily sex. Biology isn't bigotry. And so what I try to do in the book is I strive to offer a nuanced vision of our human embodiment, a balanced approach to the various public policy questions, but then also a sober and honest survey of the human costs of getting human nature wrong. What I want to do this morning is first go through some of the claims that are being made by transgender activists. And I want to immediately distinguish people who suffer from gender dysphoria, people who identify as transgender, from the activists. Most people with gender dysphoria, most people who identify as transgender, they're not activists of any sort. But there are activists who are pushing a radical ideology in our nation's courtrooms and in our nation's schools. And so the first step is important to see just what is the claim that's being made. So I'm not sure if I have a clicker or if someone else is controlling the PowerPoint. I'm not seeing a clicker, so I'm going to guess someone else is controlling the PowerPoint. Or perhaps not. Okay, so if there was a PowerPoint, there would be a slide that had this quote. So what I want to start with is, all right, it's coming up, perfect. All right, I'm going to read you a quote from a professor at Duke University. She's the head of the Duke University Clinic on Gender, which they only started 2 or 3 years ago. It shows you how new this is. And this is the expert testimony that she gave in the HB2 case. This was the North Carolina bathroom case. And there was a lawsuit that the federal government filed against the state of North Carolina, and this was the testimony that she gave. And what I want to highlight is she's making a radical claim based on her authority as a scientist and as a medical doctor, but at its heart is a philosophical and a metaphysical claim. And the debates right now are debates about the nature of the human person, just as John Paul II had told us. John Paul had said that all of the 20th centuries, the major debates about communism, socialism, about abortion, about marriage, they were all debates about the nature of the human individual, the human person. And the same thing is true today with debates about gender identity. So this is what she says. She says, quote, "From a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. It is counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for the purposes of classifying someone as male or female." Now, I'm not a medical doctor. My PhD is in political philosophy, but I always thought that it was medical science to use chromosomes and hormones and internal reproductive organs and external genitalia and secondary sex characteristics. And so her testimony, and this is a professor at Duke University School of Medicine, the director of the Duke Center for Child Gender Care, is saying that gender identity, one's internal sense of gender, overrides every objective measure of the body when it comes to our sexuality as male or female. If there was a slide and we could move to the next one, it would show how they're now trying to teach this in the nation's schools. Because while Dr. Adkins is a professor at Duke University's medical school, they're now trying to teach all of your children and grandchildren that what she is saying is truth. So your kids are being catechized, not with the Baltimore Catechism, but with something known as the genderbread person. And the genderbread person, it looks like a gingerbread man, and then it says that there are 5 different aspects of the human person when it comes to our sexual identity. There's gender identity, which is, quote, how you, in your head, define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender, end quote. And the graphic then lists, quote, 4 of infinite possibilities. There's womanness, there's manness, there's two-spirit, there's genderqueer, and then there are an infinite number of alternative possibilities. In addition to gender identity, there's gender expression, which is, quote, the way you present gender through your actions, dress, and demeanor. And the options they list there are feminine, masculine, butch, femme, androgynous, or gender neutral. In addition to this, they have biological sex, which got the genderbread person in trouble, and I'll mention that in a minute. And then they have sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to. The genderbread person got in trouble for 2 reasons. One was that activists claimed the genderbread person looked too much like a man. It looked like a genderbread man. And the second is that it said that there was biological sex. And that's now a big no-no for the gender ideologues. So the new image that they're using is a cartoon character known as the gender unicorn. And it's appropriate, it's a unicorn, it's a mythical creature. And if we had a slide, you would see this colorful unicorn, and what it now says is sex assigned at birth. The idea here is that when you were born, a doctor just randomly assigned a sex to you, but that may or may not be who you actually are. Your gender identity is what should determine this. Your gender identity, which is how you feel internally, should override your chromosomes, your hormones, your internal reproductive organs, your external genitalia, and your secondary sex characteristics. This is what your children and your grandchildren are being taught as the truth about themselves. And so whether your children, your grandchildren struggle with gender dysphoria or not, they'll be much more likely to have greater difficulty in the maturation process. All of us, maturation is difficult. Developing into a mature man or woman is already a fraught process. And now these new pedagogical tools will make it that much more difficult, not just for those who struggle with gender dysphoria, but for everyone. The transgender ontology, how they understand who and what the person is, then gives rise to the transgender medical approach. So I want to just fill you in on what the standard of care is as put forth by the World Professional Association of Transgendered Health Experts, WPATH. It's a 4-part standard of care, and the first step is social transition. So for a child as young as 3 or 4 years old, a child with gender dysphoria should be encouraged to transition socially. What this means is that a child will be given a new wardrobe, a new name, new pronouns, and have access to the new bathroom that corresponds with their gender identity. So if you remember back a year ago when the Obama administration issued that Dear Colleague letter that said all of the public schools would have to open up their bathrooms, their locker rooms, their sports teams, their dorm rooms based on gender identity, not biological sex, that was part of this first step. That was part of the first step of encouraging students as young as 3 or 4 years old to socially transition. The second step is that as a child approaches puberty, they should be administered drugs that will block puberty to prevent them from going through puberty in the wrong body. So the idea here is that if you're a boy, but you identify as a girl, if around age 9, 10, 11, 12, you were to start going through masculine puberty, you would be developing in the wrong body, and that would make your gender dysphoria worse. So what they're doing is they're prescribing puberty blockers and using them indefinitely. These drugs were developed originally to delay puberty by a couple of months or a year for children who were going through puberty too early. There's a condition known as precocious puberty. A child might start going through puberty at age 7 or 8, and they would put them on this drug to delay it until an age-appropriate time. Now they indefinitely delay puberty until the third step of this protocol, which is at age 16 is what currently is called for, but doctors are now suggesting they bump it earlier in life to age 14, administer cross-sex hormones to initiate the opposite sex puberty in the child's body. So at age 14, there's the gender unicorn. It's now on my screen. It's not on your screen, but I can see what it looks like. There it is. I've never heard such, thank you. I've never heard such a robust applause for the gender unicorn. But this is what's being used in public schools across the United States. This is what children are being indoctrinated into. And it will lead more of them to go home and tell their parents that they're actually a boy trapped in a girl's body or a girl trapped in a boy's body. There'll be then, more children will be given puberty blockers at age 8 or 9 or 10. And then at age 14, 15, or 16, boys will be given estrogen to feminize their bodies, and girls will be given testosterone to masculinize their bodies. That's the third step of the protocol. And then the fourth step is that at age 18, once the child is now a legal adult, they're eligible for sex reassignment surgery. Sex reassignment surgery can entail both what's known as top surgery and bottom surgery. I'm not going to go through the details here. I do, unfortunately, go through the details in the book. Needless to say, you can't reassign sex because sex isn't the type of thing that is assigned in the first place. And so while you can remove certain body parts and you can use plastic surgery to try to create things that mimic the opposite sex's sexual organs, you haven't actually reassigned sex. What you've done is mutilated someone's body and then tried to masculinize or feminize what remains. From the transgender ontology goes the transgender medicine, and then the third step is transgender policy. I heard as one of the Legatus leaders was receiving a prize, they had mentioned the HHS contraception mandate. Fewer people know that in the last year of the Obama administration, there was an HHS transgender mandate. The Department of Health and Human Services mandated every healthcare plan to cover sex reassignment procedures and every qualified physician to perform them. What this meant is that if you were a doctor who would perform a hysterectomy or a mastectomy because of cancer, you would now have to perform those same treatments for sex reassignment purposes. If you were an endocrinologist and you would do testosterone treatment for someone with low testosterone, a man with low testosterone, you would now also have to do testosterone treatment for a woman who wants to become a man. Otherwise, you would be violating federal civil rights law. Thankfully, an order of Catholic nuns in Indiana who runs a hospital, they filed a lawsuit against this. It was struck down on New Year's Eve by a federal judge in Texas right before it was to go into effect on New Year's Day. And then a year ago, the Trump administration declined to appeal that. They said, we're going to leave the judge's order in place. The Obama Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, they're the ones who had brought this. And then the Trump administration said, no, we're going to let the judge have the final word here. The ACLU is currently suing 2 Catholic hospitals, one in New Jersey and one in California, because they declined to do sex reassignment surgeries. The argument here is that these hospitals are anti-trans. They're discriminating on the basis of gender identity. What the hospitals say is, no, we don't think surgery is the appropriate medical response to gender dysphoria. We think mental health care, psychology, and psychiatry are the appropriate ways of treating gender dysphoria. And not every disagreement is discrimination, and we shouldn't be making good medicine illegal in our country, nor should we be forcing Catholic healthcare institutions to violate their beliefs, forcing them to practice bad medicine. But that's what follows. Once you get the transgender ontology in place, that gender identity determines everything, then you get the transgender medicine, and then the transgender law and public policy comes in place. Now, I'm trained in philosophy, So I wanted to analyze our transgender moment to say, what are the ideas that are animating this? And so as I read through the leading works promoting this, I saw that the transgender worldview combines a new form of the ancient philosophy of Gnosticism, in which the real self is something other than a material body, while at the same time embracing materialism, in which nothing but material bodies exist. And the transgender worldview is full of philosophical contradictions. And so this first one, on the one hand, they're all materialists, but on the other hand, the real self is something other than the material body, so that you could be trapped in the wrong body. The transgender worldview, it relies on rigid sex stereotypes, in which girls play with dolls and boys play with trucks, and yet it insists that gender is purely a social construct, and so there are no meaningful differences between men and women, all the while insisting that gender identity is real and meaningful, but biological sex is not. It embraces a radical expressive individualism, where people should be free to do whatever they want and to define the truth however they wish it to be, but it enforces a ruthless paternalism in which anyone who dares dissent will be punished. And so I want to ask a series of questions, things that you can pose to your neighbors and friends who have bought into transgender ideology. If gender is a social construct, how can gender identity be innate and immutable? That is, how can one's identity with respect to a social construct be determined by biology in the womb? If gender is a social construct, how can I be trapped in the wrong social construct? These concepts don't fit together. And what does it even mean to have an internal sense of gender? What does gender feel like? Apart from a body, what meaning can we give to the concept of sex or gender? And thus, what internal sense of gender can we have? Let me put this more concretely. Apart from my having a male body, what does it feel like to be a man? How would I know what it feels like to be a woman? Or to put this even more pointedly, what does it feel like to be both a man and a woman? Or to be neither? Because if you remember the gender unicorn, it's not just that you can be a man or a woman, you can be both, you can be neither, you can be something else altogether. How would we know what those feelings feel like? How would we know what it feels like to be trapped in the wrong body? But also, why should our feelings determine reality? Why does feeling like a man make you a man? Why does feeling like a woman make you a woman? Our feelings don't determine reality on anything else. Very few are the people who go along with Rachel Dolezal, the white woman who identifies as black. And so if someone who is transgender is the sex with which they identify, why isn't someone the race with which they identify? And what about people who identify as animals, able-bodied people who identify as disabled? Do all of these identities determine reality? And if not, why not? And why only on gender identity? And do all of these people, is the compassionate thing to do to give them hormones and surgery to transform their bodies in accordance with their minds? Species reassignment surgery, racial reassignment surgery. We don't do this on any other condition of false beliefs or mistaken feelings. Why would we do it here? The chapter of the book that was most difficult for me to research and to write was the chapter that dealt with people who had transitioned and then detransitioned. People who had transitioned thinking that this would provide them with the healing and the wholeness which they desired, and then 5 or 10 or 15 years later discovered it had only made their lives worse. Particularly troubling were the stories of young people who had transitioned and then in their 20s or 30s detransitioned. These stories, they complicate the sunny picture that the mainstream media wants to tell on this. When Bruce becomes Caitlyn, that'll get a 2-hour 2020 special, but there won't be a 2020 special for the children who transitioned and then a decade later detransitioned. Many of these people, they say that they felt pressured into transitioning, that it was presented as their only real choice. Many of them regret the permanent damage they've done to their bodies, their lost fertility. Many of them feel that they were much too young to be making these life-altering decisions. And so I want to read you a couple quotes. I think I have time to read all three of these, and I'm going to go to the next slide so you can read along with me. I was put on hormones after 3 months of therapy at the age of 17. In fact, because I was only seeing a therapist once per month, it was after 3 or 4 visits that I was prescribed testosterone, with no meaningful attempt made to process the issues that I brought up that led in part to my wish to transition. When I was transitioning, no one in the medical or psychological field ever tried to dissuade me, to offer other options, to do really anything to stop me besides tell me I should wait until I was 18. I want to ask you, how many other medical conditions are there where you can walk into the doctor's office, tell them you have a certain condition, which has no objective test, which can be caused by trauma or mental health issues or societal factors, and receive life-altering medications on your say-so? She continues, I think the prospect of completely changing your body, your life, your identity is very compelling to a teenager who is just learning to cope with mental health issues, with trauma, with gender nonconformance, with being a lesbian. And that's especially true when the current rhetoric around transition really discourages any kind of questioning. It really frames transitioning or trans identity as the solution to any kind of gender issue or gender confusion. And I think it's really important for therapists not to frame transition as the only solution, to really present options and to encourage people not to take their feelings and urges entirely at face value, to be critical, to really think about where those thoughts are coming from. And then finally, I wanted to make a video previously so that folks can see that I'm a real live person, but I didn't out of fear of showing my face. But I think it's important when we talk about these issues to really understand that women like us aren't just statistics, not just some dry data some gatekeeping doctor might throw at you. We're real people. This is the real outcome of transition. I'm a real live 22-year-old woman with a scarred chest and a broken voice and 5 o'clock shadow because I couldn't face the idea of growing up to be a woman. That's my reality. These are the types of stories that unfortunately we're going to see multiplying in the coming years and decades. And people like us who point out that the emperor has no clothes, we will be vilified, we will be called bigots. But what I want to encourage you with is to say that the only institution in American public life who will tell the truth on this will be the church. It won't be secular big business. It won't be Hollywood. It won't be the news media. It won't be the universities. The only institution that will tell the truth about the human person, human identity, created male and female, will be yourselves. You notice I said secular business. We're at Legatus. So there will be Catholic business people. It'll be Catholic media people. It'll be Catholics in Hollywood. It'll be Catholics in medicine. It'll be Catholics in the university system. Apart from that, you're going to see that the special interests and the gender ideology lobby will try to steamroll anyone who puts up opposition. In the time I have left, I want to just say a couple of words of what the alternative looks like. What was Dr. McHugh doing? What does he still do at Johns Hopkins? McHugh is now a professor emeritus, but he's in his 80s and he still sees patients at Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins just last summer announced that they were reopening their sex reassignment clinic, even though nothing has changed in terms of the data. In fact, we now have new data that shows just how grim the long-term outcomes are for people who transition. But under social pressure, the hospital has reopened the clinic. What would McHugh do? McHugh would engage in talk therapy, and he would try to understand with a child, why do you think you're a boy trapped in a girl's body, or a girl trapped in a boy's body? I cite, I guess it's chapter 6 in the book that focuses on some of the clinical evidence with children. And I want to share just two of those stories. One involves a young boy, and this comes from a clinic in Canada. A young boy who was being bullied by his peer group. He wasn't a very rambunctious boy, he wasn't very physical, and the other boys in his class were picking on him. And he was finding solace and comfort with some of his female classmates. And he started developing interests that were stereotypically feminine. And as a way of coping with the harassment and the bullying that he was receiving, he had told himself that he was actually a girl. And so when the parents took him to see a therapist and they were engaging in talk therapy, the doctor says, "Why do you think you're a girl?" And he was like, "Well, girls are nice. Girls don't bully people. Girls aren't mean to people. Girls are gentle. Girls like the things that I like." And so the physician said to the parents, "You need to find your son a new peer group. If you find your son other boys who are more like him, you will, one, take him out of a toxic environment, but then two, you'll place him in a new environment that will enlarge his own way of thinking about the acceptable ways of being a boy." Because he has a very narrow understanding of what it means to be a boy, and he doesn't fit into that narrow understanding, he's coping by convincing himself he's a girl. And so they found him a new peer group. They found him other boys who weren't bullies, who were more sensitive. They were interested in the things he was interested in. And I think it was within 6 months he was re-identifying as a boy. They spared him a life of puberty-blocking drugs, and then estrogen, and then surgery. And once you remove your sex glands, your sex organs, you're going to be seeing an endocrinologist for the rest of your life. Because one way or the other, either through artificial estrogen or through testosterone, if you detransition, your body can no longer produce its own hormones. And they spared their son that suffering. Let me share you one last example. This was a young boy who is now identifying as a girl. And in the course of family therapy, the doctor determined that the cause of the child's gender dysphoria lied in unresolved trauma with the mother. The mother had been a victim of sexual assault when she was a teenager, and as a result of that sexual assault, she had developed an antipathy towards men. And so she had 2 children. She had a daughter and a son, and she was much more affectionate with her daughter than she was with her son. Not intentionally, it was just subconscious. Because of the way that men had victimized her, she couldn't be fully affectionate even with her own son. Her son had picked up on this. Her son was identifying as a girl as a way of trying to curry his mother's affection. And so when the doctor was able to identify that as the cause of the gender dysphoria in the child, he was able to find the mother a therapist who could help her resolve her unresolved trauma. She was then able to be more affectionate to her son. Her son was then able to more readily identify as a boy. And again, another life spared from cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, and all the rest. I'm exactly on time, so I'm going to not go over. I'm going to stop simply by saying there's much too much at stake at this moment in time, which I've picked up on the title of transgender moment, partly to suggest that I think this is fleeting. This is not going to stand the test of time. This is not going to be around 50, 100 years from now. We will look back on this and ask ourselves, what were we thinking when we were doing these medical experiments on children? That said, in the meantime, it's going to be incredibly controversial to say the truth, to speak the truth. And so the reason I've written this book is to try to equip all of us to be able to speak the truth in love. Because the only way that people who disagree with us are even going to be open to considering what we have to say is if we can say it in ways that are accessible to them and that come across as compassionate and loving. Thank you.
Please join us for the 2019 summit at the Monarch Beach Resort in Dana Point, California, January 24th through the 26th, 2019.